anatomists and physiologists. This video is the first of our reproductive system series. This is from chapter 27. Today we're just going to talk about reproductive anatomy. So let's get started. The goals for our repro lecture series are to talk about the anatomy, which we're doing today, the histology of male and female reproductive systems, but we'll also talk about physiology. We'll include the processes of sperm making, spermatogenesis, egg cell making, oogenesis, and how those systems are regulated. We'll also discuss sexual response. We'll talk about ovulation, menstruation, and then we'll finish off the semester by talking about fertilization, pregnancy, childbirth, lactation. All right, so let's go. We're talking about anatomy, but we'll talk a lot about like the differences between male and female reproductive anatomy and physiology. But I want to remind you that there's so many similarities. Both males and females have gonads. Gonads are those primary sex organs that do two major jobs. So even though there's two different types of gonads, they're still doing the same types of jobs. So the gametes, those are what's produced by the gonads, and gametes are the sex cells. In males, this is sperm cells, and in females, this is egg cells. Egg cells, eggs, oocyte. It's spelled like oocyte, but it's oocyte. You can also call it an ovum. All of those words are the same. So gonads produce gametes, and just so you know, the gonads in males are testes, and the gonads in females are ovaries. But like, who cares about the differences at this exact time? Because they both produce sex cells. In addition to that, they both produce sex hormones. It's not the physiology lecture, so I won't jump into that one too much until we get there. We'll come back to sex hormones in just 1 second, but not too much. Okay, so primary sex organs, we have gonads. But also there's accessory reproductive organs. And what this looks like are both males and females have a bunch of ducts, a bunch of glands, and external genitalia. So while you're studying, think about, okay, what's the gonad? What's the gamete? What's the sex hormone? These are all of the things that are going to continue to be same, just have different names and do slightly different things. Okay, so talking about sex hormones real quick, because the repro system is kind of funny because we don't really activate that system until puberty, but that only gets activated by hormones. So it's an endocrine system thing, the sex hormones thing. And we have to remember, we've already learned this, who's in charge of the endocrine system? That's our old buddy hypothalamus. So we have to think about, okay, so we have the hypothalamus. Remember, that's endocrine CEO. Which is hormones, everything related to hormones, old buddy hypothalamus. Hypothalamus often talks to the anterior pituitary. Remember the anterior pituitary, that's the one that releases those tropic hormones, the regulatory hormones that cause like hormone secretion in other structures. Do you remember the anterior pituitary releases gonadotropins? Those are FSH, LH. Do you remember those? Look back in your notes. We talked about this. And then FSH and LH, they go act on the gonads. So the ovaries and the testes. That activation happens during puberty. And that's because those gonads will have FSH and LH act on them to release their sex hormones. The hypothalamus only really becomes able to start this pathway during puberty, and we'll talk more about this when we get more into the physiology. But the thing about this is this activation, it happens during puberty, and those reproductive organs, they start to grow to adult size, right? And then as they grow, the hypothalamus is more and more able to release its hormones to start this whole process of sex hormone release. And over time, more and more sex hormones are released until they reach adult levels. And that's when so many changes happen during puberty. So the reproductive systems look very, very different early in life versus later in life. So there's lots of similarities. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Okay, so our textbook first talks about male reproductive anatomy, so that's what I'll discuss first. So right here, what we're looking at is a sagittal section of male reproductive anatomy. This picture is something we've kind of seen before, but the emphasis is different. We've seen this when we've talked about the urinary system. But now our focus is actually like on those reproductive organs. Okay, so we have the gonads, right? Those are the testes. So singular is testis, plural is testes. Just so you know. So those gonads, that's the testis, right? And the testes, they live in this sac called the scrotum. I'm gonna highlight that word scrotum. I'm gonna show you a picture of the scrotum after this one. And so that word scrotum literally means pouch. It's like layers of skin and fascia and muscle. And then the scrotum is actually like divided. So there's two testes, right? Like in between the two testes, there's like a little divider line. And that keeps the testes like in their own little area. But it's also important to note that the scrotum lies on the outside of the body, and that helps keep the testis away from the core temperatures inside the body. And that's important because the testes, they remain about 3 or so degrees cooler than our core temperature. That's really beneficial because sperm production needs to happen a little bit cooler than the core temperatures of our body, but we'll discuss sperm production later. Okay, so on to the testis. That's this little white part here. This is where sex cells are produced. This is the gonad. So the testis, remember, we have so many similarities, right? So this is the gonad. Testis is the gonad where sperm are made. So the white part is the testis, but also that lives within the scrotum is this comma-shaped thing. That's called the epididymis. Epididymis. The epididymis is like this place where sperm are made in the testis, travel into the epididymis, and then they travel into this next tube. The tube that goes up and over and around, that has its own name. It's called the ductus deferens or the vas deferens. The ductus deferens or the vas deferens, that's where sperm go to next. So from all the way here. Like if you've ever heard of that word vasectomy, this is the tube that they cut. The vas deferens in a vasectomy. And that gets ligated or cauterized as a form of birth control, a vasectomy. Anyway, so sperm travel up and through this tube, through this little thickened part, which is called the ampulla of the ductus deferens. And then we travel through into this little duct here. That duct joins with the urethra. So the duct that joins with the urethra is called the ejaculatory duct. And it's pretty short, right? Like from the ductus deferens, we go from into this really short ejaculatory duct, and then we join, and it's the same story that we already know. Prostatic urethra, intermediate part, and then spongy urethra on out. However, what's traveling through from the testis, through the epididymis, into the ductus deferens, around through here, into this ejaculatory duct, like once we're like in the penis and in this spongy urethra, we're joined by the secretions of 3 glands that produce semen. So I'm going to write this word down because I think it's good to know. So the word semen I think of it as sperm plus stuff. Sperm plus stuff. And the stuff is produced by the glands. So we have some glands here. The seminal gland, that's this one here. We have the prostate gland, that's this walnut-shaped one. And then lastly, we have the bulbourethral gland. I've seen bulbourethral spelled with or without the dash in it, so just choose your own adventure when it comes to spelling. Anyway, so all those three glands will then make contributions to sperm, which make then sperm plus stuff equals semen, right? So then all of that semen travels out through the spongy urethra. And then lastly, we see here is the penis, which consists of spongy erectile tissue. Note that the penis, it begins pretty far backwards, actually, inside the body, but it extends along outside so that it's outside with the scrotum. And it's all blue to indicate that that's the spongy erectile tissue in there. And it's contained in like some major regions that I'll show you later. Anyways, but it's erectile tissue. And what that means is that there's lots of connective tissue and smooth muscle here, but also lots of vasculature. And in times of sexual excitement, that smooth muscle that's in there will relax. And just like we know already, vasodilation, we learned about this in blood vessels, when smooth muscle of vasculature relaxes, that increases blood flow. And then increasing blood flow causes the penis to engorge and become more rigid, and that's called erection. Okay, so this is really broad overview, but we're going to zoom in on a lot of these structures over the course of the next few slides. Here's a good picture that shows more about those characteristics of the scrotum I was telling you about before. So here is that layer of the skin there on the outside. That's the part that has the hair on it. And that happens during puberty, is that growth of hair. But then there's also some fascia in there that contain this muscle called the dartus muscle. There's also this muscle called the cremaster muscle. Since the scrotum has this really important job of keeping the testis at just the right temperature, there's these muscles help, right? So this muscle dartus increases how wrinkles in the scrotum. And that's helpful, especially during the cold, because it reduces surface area and that reduces heat loss, right? But if it's warmer, that dartus muscle kind of relaxes, those wrinkles start to increase to encourage heat loss, just to make sure that we're just at the right temperature. And then this cremaster muscle, that one is a skeletal muscle, actually, that elevates the testis towards the core. Elevates testis towards the core to warm up if needed. And so the dartus and the cremaster muscle both work to make sure that the scrotum temperature is constant. That's important for the development of sperm. Okay, so notice how the scrotum kind of holds this testis in a little sac, and then there's that septum that I was talking to you about. We'll discuss more about like the individual testis next, but how all of this tissue, like how all of this stuff is connected to the rest of the body is through what's called the spermatic cord. I'm going to highlight that spermatic cord. That's like all of this stuff. So all of that is called the spermatic cord. And it consists of a bunch of stuff, right? It's the same track that we can follow the ductus deferens through. So the ductus deferens are part of here. Like to go up. But also what's in here is a bunch of autonomic nerve fibers. So lots and lots and lots of innervation. And then also this pampiniform venous plexus. And this helps with temperature regulation. Anyways, but all of these structures, they travel through this little portion called the inguinal canal. So there's a little bit sheet of connective tissue here, and then through that sheet of connective tissue into the abdominal pelvic cavity. Because there's so many nerves and blood vessels here, especially like visceral sensory nerves, when the testes are hit very forcefully, it's super painful and sometimes can result in nausea, like nauseated feelings. Okay, so let's zoom in on the testis. This is a single testis in sagittal section. So the white, remember that in like here, there's like the white part of the testis, right? And that's the same thing. All of this, that appears white. And then there's like that comma-shaped thing that's called the epididymis. And then off of the epididymis is the start of the ductus deferens that goes up into the spermatic cord. The testis has two major layers on the outside. And the thing to remember here is that the word tunic or tunica means layer in anatomy and physiology land. So tunic, tunica, that means layer. It sounds like a scary word, but just layer. Okay, so there's an outer layer, and that outer layer is a serous membrane, actually. So there's the tunica vaginalis. And notice since it's a serous membrane, there's an outer part, an inner part, and then there's a cavity there in between. Then the white layer is called the white layer, tunica albuginea. The tunica albuginea literally means white. Albu, like think like albino rabbits, you know? Like the white cute ones with little red eyes. So cute. Okay, go Google it if you don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm distracting you. The next thing that's inside, after what's in the tunica albuginea, are these little things called seminiferous tubules. Seminiferous means sperm bearing. Like lots of sperm in there, because that's where sperm are actually made, is seminiferous tubules. Again, more on this later when we get to the physio part. The seminiferous tubules, notice how they're kind of like, they have like their own groups. Do you see that? They're like in their own groups. And those individual groups are called lobules. So the lobules are little groups of seminiferous tubules. Once the sperm are made, they go through this. I'm going to zoom in because it's so small. So this is seminiferous tubule here, all of that. And then the seminiferous tubule will release that sperm into this very short little tube. And it's very short and very straight, so it's called the straight tubule. From the straight tubule, we enter this like network of tubes. And that network of tubes is called the rete testis. The rete testis. I'm zooming out again because we got a little zoomed in. So from the straight tubule, we go into the rete testis, and then from the rete testis, we'll leave out of the efferent ductules. Do you remember efferent means like exit, right? So we're exiting the testis. Those efferent ductules will get us into the epididymis, which is this whole part. The epididymis consists of a bunch of little tubies. And all of those little tubes is where immature sperm go from the testis. Immature sperm come hang out here, and then they kind of like meander their way through these tubes. Meander their way through these tubes. And that's where sperm go to mature, but also be stored until ejaculation. So the epididymis, its whole vibe is sperm maturation, and sperm storage. Because sperm hang out here until ejaculation. And if that sperm is not ejaculated, that epididymis has mechanisms that will cause phagocytosis eventually. And that can happen like months after storage, right? But during ejaculation, there's some smooth muscle in the layers of this epididymis that contract and send that sperm into the next tube, which is the ductus deferens. So we'll talk about that next. Okay, before we do that, I want to remind you that here we are. Okay, so we've talked about the testis, sperm made, immature sperm released into the epididymis, we mature, we store, and then upon ejaculation, we go through the ductus deferens, up, over, to the side, and a little bit behind the bladder, and then now we go into the ejaculatory duct. Like, that's where we're going. Just want to make sure we're on the same page, that's all. Okay, so this is a different view. But now that we remember how everything's oriented, I can show you this. I think it's really good, but a bit funny to understand if we didn't have like the previous picture really fresh in our brain. Okay, so we have testis, we have epididymis, and then from there, upon ejaculation, sperm enters the ductus deferens. Then we'll go into that little ampulla of the ductus deferens. Ampulla is like an enlarged part. So highlight that ampulla. That's just like the little like bigger part right there. And then from there, we'll enter the ejaculatory duct. That's this guy here. So the ejaculatory duct is then what gets us into the prostatic urethra. However, we're also joined by the contributions to semen, which are from those glands I told you about. So I'm going to highlight all of that, the gland stuff in pink. Okay, so first we have the seminal gland. The seminal gland adds like 70% of semen's volume. There's a lot of stuff being added into, so just sperm, and now it's semen because it's sperm plus stuff. Because that seminal gland will also drain into the prostatic urethra. So that seminal gland will release a bunch of stuff. It makes the semen a little bit like yellowish. It makes it a little bit alkaline and viscous. Viscous means like thick, like honey-like, not like water. But it also has a bunch of other stuff like sugar, which can be helpful for like ATP as an energy source, and other stuff like citric acid, a coagulating enzyme, prostaglandins. So I'll write some of this stuff down. So I'm going to zoom in here, like kind of on this side. Okay, so there's just some general categories of stuff that we can add into semen. So we can add like coagulatory factors. And that helps make sure that right after ejaculation, that sperm is a little bit coagulated or thicker, which helps the sperm stick to the inside of the female reproductive tract. Here's the weird thing, right? Because after that coagulation stops, because sperm are less motile in it, right? But the actions of other enzymes allow for that sperm to be more mobile, and that coagulation kind of stops. So it coagulates at first, but then thins out later. We also have prostaglandins. Prostaglandins, they act on the mucus of the cervix, and we'll get to that in a little bit later in this video. But those prostaglandins, they act on that mucus, and it makes that mucus more watery, less viscous, right? Which helps sperm get through there. Prostaglandins also encourage uterine peristalsis, which is also helpful for sperm movement in the female reproductive tract. There's also tons of enzymes for motility. Motility for the sperm, stuff to make ATP, that kind of thing. So semen in general produce a lot of that kind of stuff. Okay, so there's the seminal gland, lots of stuff. But once we're in the prostate, the prostatic urethra, then we have more secretions being added. This is like 1/3 of the secretions being added to semen in the prostate. Remember that semen is sperm plus stuff, right? The prostate also has smooth muscle that contracts during ejaculation, and then it adds like the milkier secretions. Makes that semen a little bit more milky. And it also has an energy for sperm, energy source for sperm called citrate, and then enzymes. The last gland that we have to talk about is this bulbourethral gland. That kind of hangs out in the urogenital diaphragm on either side. And the bulbourethral gland mostly has its secretions go into the spongy urethra. And that's important because what's interesting about male reproductive anatomy is that this is a shared tube. It's a urethra for urine, but it's also for semen. And so if there's any remaining urine here, urine is acidic, but sperm don't like acid. And so we'd like to neutralize that acid that might be left over from the urine that might be in there. And so the bulbourethral gland has secretions to lubricate, like mucus. But also helps with neutralizing acid. From any traces of urine that might be hanging out in there. All of these secretions will result in what we know as semen, sperm plus stuff, which is overall alkaline. And that's really important because sperm don't like acid. Sperm don't really work that well in acidic conditions. And so the alkalinity of semen helps. The alkalinity of semen also helps once that semen gets into the female reproductive tract because it helps neutralize the acidic environment of the female reproductive tract. Okay, showing you this picture one more time to segue into talking about the penis. This is the externalmost part of male anatomy, so it makes it the organ of copulation or sexual intercourse. Interestingly, though, we have this root of the penis that's kind of more inside the body where it's attached, and then the unattached part is the part that's outside the body. The end of the penis is a little bit enlarged, and that's called the glands. So that external or endomost part of the penis. And then that part called the glands is covered by the prepuce or the foreskin. But that procedure, circumcision, is when the prepuce, that foreskin is removed. Okay, back to this picture. But our focus here is the penis. We have the root of the penis. The root of the penis is like this whole portion. It consists of the bulb of the penis, that's this part, and then the crust, which are these two little parts that attach. And then attaches to the body. Okay, and the end again is called the glands. That's this whole end, like enlarged part, and that has the foreskin or the prepuce on it. But all of this in blue is the erectile tissue, which is organized into three major sections, right? So notice that all of it kind of goes all the way down. And then that middle part of the penis is called the body, like the main part. So if we were to take a section of this tissue, we can see the organization of that spongy erectile tissue, or of that erectile tissue. So here we have the penis in section. So we have the urethra. The urethra, that's this guy right here. And that is surrounded by this erectile tissue called the corpus spongiosum. Corpus spongiosum. And then there's two corpora cavernosa. So this is just a funny anatomy thing here. So corpora is the plural. That means there's two of them. corpus is the singular. So we can say this is one corpus cavernosa, one corpus spongiosum, but we have two corpora cavernosa. And you get what I mean? It's weird. Okay, so then we also have to think about the other words. Is cavernosa is cave-like, spongiosum is spongy. And each of these pieces of erectile tissue are kind of surrounded by this connective-ish tissue called tunica albuginea. Again, white layer. Remember that during erection, the smooth muscle of the vasculature in here, all of this vasculature kind of relaxes, and that allows for the penis to engorge with blood and become more rigid.